I'm a professor of organizational studies at Wake Forest University. That organizational behavior is my field, and I tell people, and simply it's the studies surrounding how to be nice to employees so they'll perform for you. And that makes a lot of sense here. Within that field, we have a lot of different topics, and one of them is leadership. And I do some leadership research, and particularly in the area of abusive supervision. And I published at least 3 top studies and one on the way, hopefully, that speak to this. And I'll just tell you a little bit about them. One is that the first one was that what do targets do when they're bullied? And this was really drawing on the communications literature. And it said, do they directly confront their supervisor, or do they kind of avoid? And it was very interesting, the findings. The majority of people avoid, and it keeps them feeling bad, like depressed and anxious. And the minority of people confront, and it makes them feel better, but then they may risk retaliation. So it's really a bit of a quandary. And then the next paper was with a prolific researcher in this area named Ben Tepper. And we studied what are some of the characteristics of victims that might make them more provocative victims. And one of those main areas was being dissimilar, being perceived as dissimilar. And we've talked about gender differences and international students and racial differences and so forth. The third study had to do with, very interesting, how sometimes we think of poor performers as eliciting the wrath of their supervisors, but in this study, we found that strong performers are also likely to be targets, particularly if the supervisor is threatened by that strong performer. So some of you may relate to that. And finally, this study that we're trying to get published now talks about the trickle-down effects of leadership. It's very much like the patterns of behavior in families. If you see your parents do this, you're likely to do this. And leadership behaviors trickle down. And actually, negative, abusive supervisory behaviors trickle down much more strongly than do positive leadership behaviors. And that is a real cause for concern here, because the students that we're training and the young faculty members that we are overseeing, if they're seeing our abusive behavior, then they're very likely to turn around and do that when they're in positions of power as well. One of my colleagues has a saying that says, research is me search. And when I heard her say that, I got concerned, because one of my main areas is abusive supervision. And I really don't think I'm an abusive supervisor, but I just wanted to let you know, on the positive side, I also study meaningful work and how some people find meaningfulness in their work as a result of holding multiple jobs. So I do other stuff besides this as well. So let me move on and say some of the research that I've done on abusive supervision has been, talked about and published, and I've done podcasts and so forth with NPR, BBC, Harvard Business Review. But then when I got involved with bullying and academic science, then it started to progress to things like Nature and bioimpacts. And I've spoken a couple of times at Duke University on the topic. And even been a member on a podcast with Morteza from Science Rehash, which was kind of fun. I think that should be coming out soon. But how did this happen? I am an organizational researcher. I've been studying this in regular business organizations. But what actually happened is that Nature called, and literally Nature called and actually emailed and sent me an email and said, hey, Sherry, we know you do research on abusive supervision. Would you be willing to talk about abusive supervision or bullying in academic science? And while this is often the case with me, my entire body was screaming no, but my mouth said yes, in a lack of ability to self-manage. And then I said, the reason my mouth said yes was because I've had my own students come to me and talk to me about their experiences in the lab. And so I hate to admit it, but we have, MBA, PhD students here, and they've been in my classes, and I've had them come to me and talk to me about experiences that they've had like this. So I knew I had some stories. I also could imagine, by my understanding of how science progresses, that the power differentials in the lab may be even stronger than they are in a typical organization. So back to this, I wrote this opinion piece. I literally wrote it in one day. We passed it back and forth a couple of times, and they published it a couple of weeks later. And then the avalanche happened. I could have never expected what would happen as a result of writing that piece. I started getting a million emails, and with gut-wrenching stories, with the same emotion that I hear from some of you that are sharing your stories on here. And it just got to me. I mean, literally dozens of emails, some of the people I talked to on the phone. And one of the first stories that came to me, and I'm going to read this to you because I think my job here is really to try to leave us all with a real feeling of the impact of this kind of behavior. And so the story is that was emailed to me from a female medical postdoc that was an international student. I had a very traumatic time at one of the first-class institutions after making allegations against my supervisor for professional misconduct. It was a postdoc. I was a postdoc who developed a novel protocol which represented big progress in my field of study, and I was awarded a 2-year fellowship grant to support my research. I was prepping my manuscript for Nature, but my supervisor manipulated some of the data intentionally to increase the chance of publication. And despite my efforts asking him for correction and clarification of his wrong deeds, he submitted the paper to Nature. I again asked him to fix this, but he was bullying me and forcing me as always and pressuring me to be okay with whatever he wanted to do. This was not the first time he had forced me to participate in research misconduct, and I refused to do so. Once I asked him again, he outburst his anger over me and showed me a violent response, banging on his desk and yelling. He told me, "I did this for you." I was scared a lot and thought the next time he will hit me. So I went and reported him to the director of the department. I didn't know this could be the beginning of an endless nightmare for me. And she went on to describe the endless nightmare. And she talked about so many humiliations, threats, intimidations, retaliations, discrimination, harassment, all publicly, she says. She said they did their best to ruin her reputation and all of her opportunities to stay in the field. They withheld her paper from publication. They revoked her grant and her visa, and basically ruined her reputation. And after I talked to this young lady and after she shared her story to me, and after I read many others like this, all I could do was just think, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? And I honestly didn't know what to do. And I talked to a few more people, and I just kept thinking, what can I do? How can I help with this? And so one day, as is maybe some of you are signed up with ResearchGate, and a ResearchGate email popped up with a citation to my Nature piece. And I'm like, who would cite this opinion piece? And it was Morteza. And so I contacted him because I needed a partner in my rumination because I didn't know what to do. And so I said, hey, let's chat. So we chatted, and we wrote several opinion pieces, the ones that are in Nature and bioimpacts, and I've learned so much from him, and learned about his situation, learned a little bit more about what happens in STEM, research, and we decided to do a study together. So I'm here to talk to you about our study and some of the specific results from the study. And I'm glad after this to talk a little bit more about any other parts of the study that I don't share right now. But so we decided to put together a survey, and we asked people if they were targets or bystanders. We asked who they were, who the bullies were, where the bullying took place, what type of institution. We measured using the Tepper scale that I use to measure abusive supervision in workplaces. And we also had a checklist of behaviors that are more contextual to academic science, like authorship, misconduct, and so forth. And we also asked them about their responses, the reason for their responses, and what was the outcome of their responses. And now I'm going to talk to you about those outcomes and responses. So here's our sample. We have, close to 1,900 and counting. They're 2/3 female. They break down as being primarily postdocs and graduate students. There are even a few undergraduates, and then other people, I'm not sure who they are. I'm guessing, administrative people, lab, employees, and so forth. They come from all different fields, but these are the ones with the highest percentage. And 60% were citizens of the country where the bullying was experienced. I will note that the majority of the data comes from the United States. And again, I want to emphasize that we asked people if they were targets, and we also asked them if they were witnesses. So here's some of the preliminary findings, but I'll spend most of my time talking about the responses and results of those responses. So now we advertised this as a study about academic bullying. So it may not be surprising that 84% of respondents reported being targets, 59% reported being witnesses to bullying, and 49% reported being both targets and witnesses. Now this is interesting. White male PIs in their 40s and 50s were the majority of perpetrators. Now, at first I thought, wow, that's a significant finding, but you know what? That's about the same percentage of, white males in STEM careers anyway. So even though the majority of perpetrators, it's not disproportional to their percentage in these fields. Women are more likely to be the targets of bullying, and disproportionately so. So it's interesting that women make up the minority of people in STEM careers and in STEM students, but they are more likely to be the targets of bullying. We also, bullying disproportionately takes place in prestigious institutions. So the higher ranked the institution, the more likely the bullying. Non-citizens seem to be disproportionately targeted, although I need to do a little more analysis to figure out exactly the extent of this. Postdocs and graduate students are the most frequent targets because of those power differentials we've been talking about today. Both targets and witnesses report experiencing and witnessing similar types of bullying and outcomes. And I heard some discussion earlier today during one of the discussions about whether bullying has gotten better or worse since COVID. Here's what we've found so far, that probably because of social distancing and working from home and maybe sharing lab space and distributing it differently, the frequency of bullying has decreased, but the severity of the bullying has increased. So a little bit of a nuanced finding there. And then I'm going to ask your opinion in just a second about the most likely responses and probable outcomes. So I'm going to do a survey. But in general, the research from my field and regular business organizations and the research in academic science, when you think about what can victims of bullying do, is basically two things: fight or flight. And most of the responses fall into either one of those categories, just like any other time when we experience a threat. So I'm going to ask at this time, Morteza, would you please launch the survey? And I'm going to ask you all to answer 3 questions. So maybe you'll, Morteza, the first one is, what are bullying targets most likely to do? And once people have voted, maybe you'll go to questions 2 and 3. We'll give it another 10 seconds on this first question, and then I'll record the results. Okay, so just real quick, and then I'll share our results with you. Your results right now say 59% will say or do nothing, and 41% will seek support from friends, family, and colleagues. And nobody said that people would report it to the institution. Okay, so I'll show you our results after this. Morteza, would you also go to the next question? So if they choose not to report, what is the primary reason? Fear of retaliation, fear of their visa when they're international students, or fear of being fired? Okay, you want to share those results? Good. All right, most of you say fear of retaliation. Makes sense. And then let's do the third one, please. There we go. If the target reports to the institution, what is the likely outcome? Fair and unbiased, or unfair and biased? Okay, why don't we show the results? That was a quick vote. 90% unfair and biased. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go back to my slides now, and if you'll close out that poll, I'll show you what we actually found. Let me see how I'm doing on time. Okay, good. All right. So here's what we found. So what I'm going to do now is show you the quantitative results, and we also ask for open-ended responses, and I'm going to then talk to you about my dear colleague Morteza, who has done the gut-wrenching and emotional labor of reading through a set of these qualitative and open-ended results, and let you know how we've classified them. Okay, so the first thing says, what did targets do? The majority, well, 29% chose what we call the code of silence. They said and did nothing. 31% reported it to their institutions, and 40% sought support. So I would like, if you want to categorize those into fight or flight, then we have about 70% flying and about 30% fighting. The reason for not reporting, overwhelmingly the fear of retaliation, although we do have a big category there that is other. And then outcomes of the reporting, primarily unfair and biased, with also some other there. So we were interested in our survey that we often gave our respondents an opportunity to put other, and they often did. We usually gave them an opportunity to fill in the blank for us, and they did, and that's where our additional results come from. So the results for witnesses were very similar. We asked them, what did you do as a witness? And overwhelmingly, they supported their colleague, and very few of them, even less than the targets, reported it to the institution. Then we asked them why they didn't report, and overwhelmingly they said fear of retaliation, with a number of them saying other. And the outcomes that when they knew about the outcomes of any reporting that was done, overwhelmingly they said it was unfair and biased. And so what I want to do now is break those results down a little bit, the ones that are in that other category. And I believe that some people chose the other category because they needed a place to express what happened. I think some chose it because they chose more than one response, or they believed that their response was nuanced enough that they wanted to talk about it a little bit more. So there were 217 open-ended responses in that from the targets. I remember about 85% of the people said that they had been a target. And so we were able to categorize those into 5 different categories, and I've given you an illustrative narrative for each one. So they either did nothing, they reported to the institution, they confronted the bully, they reported to other bodies, or they applied to other labs or institutions. So they did nothing. Here's an example. I'm a PhD student and I'm afraid of an unfair outcome. There was another student in our group who reported and nothing happened. He needed to take leave at the end. Or they reported to the institution. I complained to the university. They did not follow their own prescribed guidelines for resolving complaints and allowed my PI to remove me from the lab and take away my funding and cancel my PhD position. Or they confronted the bully. First, we try to speak with him, and then he said, I'm listening to you, but he tries to pretend he is nice and giving credit for other people, even by his website and Twitter. But in reality, he never cares and uses our complaints to retaliate later. For example, removing the name from the co-author list, gossiping behind me, and in general, making me feel uncomfortable. Or they reported to other bodies. First, I believed he was right and I was incompetent, but I got help from mental health professionals and others in my professional network. I got a new postdoc 5 years out, and 4 high impact papers later, I still feel like my abuser is right and I'm incompetent. And finally, even though this was just a very minor part of the sample, they applied to other labs or institutions. If you look at the bottom of this slide, the percentages are primarily they did nothing or they reported to the institution, at least in the open-ended responses. So the next thing was like, here's an example of an example of a longer narrative about somebody flying and engaging in the code of silence. I'm a PhD in biochemistry student and am experiencing academic bullying. However, I have no courage to speak up for myself because of fear that it could affect my status as an international student. I never talked to more senior faculty members, even though I know they would listen and be supportive of me. Actually, the department itself is very welcoming and encouraging. I only talk to my lab mates who experience the same things as I do. Right now, I think I can still handle the stress until I graduate in the coming summer. I know it is wrong that I don't speak up, but there are times I also need to protect myself. I'm already a 4th-year PhD candidate, and with just one wrong move, my graduation still could be compromised. So people are walking around on eggshells. So then we ask, what is the rationale for why you didn't speak up? And overwhelmingly, they said fear of retaliation. Since this person is in power position, not only in the university, but in the National Research Council, I decided not to report because it can threaten my future career in science. These fears are based on true stories of other scientists who had a conflict with this person because of the same reason, and their careers were affected severely. Or fear of visa cancellation. Was informed I would most likely lose my job and my visa relied on my job, which is why international students are particularly vulnerable. And then some significant percentage said they didn't know where to turn. They just didn't know who to turn to or have any confidence that there would be anything positive to come from their reporting. Finally, the responses. What was the ultimate outcome? And then you can look again at the possibilities that they wrote about where retaliation actually happened 26% of the time. The bully was protected. They left the lab, institution, or even the field. The target was supported. Nothing happened, or they ended up earning a lower degree. So when we talk about retaliation, I first spoke up, but this made the situation worse. Then I reported to higher level people in my department and then to the dean's office. They destroyed my life and my academic identity as well as my dignity. They crushed my entire career. Yes, I got a lot of retaliation. Or they protected the bully. I complained, although the investigation committee validated my allegations. They did nothing to my supervisor. I was the one who had to leave. Because they asked me to continue working under my supervisor and report if anything else happened. Or they left the field, institution, or lab. A very famous professor in my field with a university structure without a fair ombudsman system. No one would want to support me against the professor due to his high rank and prestige. Although I spoke to colleagues about the situation, it was generally seen as an unavoidable situation and something to just accept. The situation became so bad that I quit my PhD and changed fields to avoid further interaction with this professor. When Leah talked earlier about the impact on science, what if this person was on the verge of discovering something new that would be helpful to humanity? And the target was supported. I talked to the ombudsman and the dean, who both supported me, and the head of the blah, blah, so that my appointment wasn't canceled. It was cut short, but not as much as initially threatened. I got therapy hours from the Institute to help cope, 10 hours, and meetings with the ombudsman to keep contact and let me know they hadn't forgotten me. That's the kind of thing that's supposed to happen. Or nothing happened. And I have two examples here because I want to emphasize something. I spoke to multiple PIs and everyone was aware of the situation, that the person abused his staff, his wife, his children. Nobody dared to intervene, as he is a superstar scientist and also has his nice and kind side when he is not stressed. Another example was I spoke to the department chair and I was told I am the problem. I am the problem. Spoke with ombudsperson and told I am not the problem, but because it was not gender-based bullying, there was nothing that could be done, which emphasizes the lack of legal remedies or in many cases institutional remedies. Or finally, some person left with their master's degree instead of their PhD because of the bullying. And we can see that these outcomes are all bad except for one, and that happened only 8% of the time, according to our data. Finally, a final anecdote to leave you with the gravitas of the situation. I too experienced this along with an entire lab of 20 others. It was mostly verbal and psychological abuse, and it was extensive. The problem was that the PI brought in a lot of grant money, and so the universities would do nothing about it. Secondly, one risked losing years of work, as well as being damaged by verbal comments and recommendation letters. These letters are particularly problematic as they are considered confidential. I had a girlfriend at the time who was a clinical psychologist, and she told me this PI was basically a psychopath. It took me a while to understand this, as it is difficult for the victim to see clearly sometimes, especially early on. However, this was spot on. The damage was considerable and lasting. I still have bad dreams about it. I'm considering doing something about it now, but I'm not sure what, other than alert the appropriate parties. I'm still in the same field, but I'm not sure my stature is secure enough to go after this. However, as with the Me Too movement, the only way to combat this problem is to expose the perpetrators and the extensive university network of deans and presidents that protect them. So, I'm sorry to have been depressing in sharing these results with you, but I think that my role here has been to hang some meat on the bones of the data that we've been sharing all day and give you some vivid stories to help us leave this meeting today with the continued motivation to continue to do what we're doing, to work on it. It's my honor to be part of this and to share the data, to work with Morteza and the other organizers of this event. And I will be happy to answer any questions I can about our survey or anything else that I might know about. So thank you.